Vamos a empezar. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the exciting panel of Spanish science fiction.
I think I'm in the wrong panel.
We're going to start introducing ourselves briefly, just for you to know who we are and why are we here. I am Cristina Jurado. I am a writer, science fiction, fantasy, horror, weird writer, as well as an editor. I am the editor of Supersonic magazine. Maybe some of you have heard of it because it's in the bag that you got when you got your accreditation. You can download our English issue for this event. I'm also the editor with Leticia of the first anthology of science fiction short stories written by women in Spanish, called Spanish Women of Wonder, and you can also get it in the bag. You have a postcard with the link to download it. I have some of my stories are in different magazines as well as anthologies, and I'm going to give now the time to Leti for her to introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Leticia Lara. As Cristina has said, I help her with the edition of the book called Spanish Women of Wonder. I'm also a blogger at fantasticaficcion.com. And I am also part of the cast that performs the Verdugos podcast, in which we talk about science fiction with Elías and other friends. And I also collaborate with Aliette de Baudard in the blog Those Who Run with Wolves. Elías.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. My name is Elías Combarro. I've been reading science fiction for 30 years, and I've been active in Spanish fandom for 15. Nowadays, I write reviews at my blog, Sense of Wonder, which is nominated for the Ignotus Award, so fingers crossed for tonight. I'm in the podcast Leticia mentioned, and I write for the Supersonic magazine, and I'm part of the team of the Terra Nova, Castles in Spain, Fantastica Nova anthologies, edited by Mariano Villarreal, and I think that mostly covers it.
We decided to talk, each of us, about a certain topic to cover what's happening right now in the Spanish science fiction landscape. I'm going to speak briefly about small presses and the importance of small dedicated presses that have appeared in the last, I would say, 5 years to now. It's an interesting phenomenon. We've witnessed this in the last few years, despite the economic crisis happening in Spain. There's a lot of initiatives that started where very dedicated people have started to create their own small presses to mainly publish Spanish authors. There's also, some of them have tried to translate into Spanish some works of mainly English-speaking authors. And I can give a few names. We can talk about Nevsky. It's very interesting, this one. Nevsky publishing company is run by Mariam and James Womack. And what is interesting is that they publish science fiction, also Russian contemporary fiction, translated into Spanish. But what they tried to do, I think it's something very courageous. They tried to publish books from Spanish, anthologies from Spanish authors, translated into English and publish it in the English-speaking market. I'm thinking, for example, the best of Spanish steampunk, which is available in English, it's a great example. One of the things I would like to mention before I forget is Marian Womack. It's a writer herself as well as an editor, and she not only writes in Spanish but also in English, which is, I think it's a phenomenon that's starting to develop in our science fiction community. Another small press that I can think about that I think is very interesting what they're doing is Sportula, which is the one that published Terra Nova anthology, not only in Spanish but in English. And again, it's a great effort to try to showcase what's happening right now in terms of science fiction in our country. And I would say not just in our country, because what they're doing with Terra Nova, it's also showing works of authors from Latin America. So I would say is more what's happening in the Spanish-speaking market. I think in the last 2 years, I've seen a lot of new small presses being born. I can think of Orsini, which covers the Bizarro genre, as well as Cazador de Ratas. It's a new small press, and they have a collection for science fiction. Apache, DeLorean, El Transbordador, Oz, and one small one that just started not long ago called Cerberos. I think it's interesting to see that there's still a lot of interest by the community to start new publishing companies, despite the problem to get help from the government to start new projects like those, as well as the high taxes that books have in our country. I would like to now give word to Leticia, who's going to talk about some interesting part of Spanish science fiction now.
If you want to read some Spanish science fiction, it's not very easy because it's not usually translated into other language. But if you especially want to read something written by a woman, it is extremely difficult. Why is this? Because we don't know why, but women have a hard time publishing in our genre. It's very hard for them to publish in science fiction. Fortunately, there has been movements about this topic in order to make more visible these authors to the great public. For example, as we have mentioned before, the anthology Spanish Women of Wonder. But there is also other movements to make the women more visible. For example, last month in October, there was a hashtag Leo Autoras Oct, which can be translated as I read women writers in October, in order to to try to prioritize reading women instead of reading men. Normally, if you don't make a conscious effort to read women, we are all biased to read men, even if we don't know about it. If you think about what your 10 or 12 last book has been, the book that you have read, it would be very difficult to find one or two women. I invite you to make this mental exercise, and maybe you will discover that it's not balanced. So I think it's important. This movement to make the works of the women more visual. We hope that with this with these ideas, or the new group in Goodreads, Make Back Felicidad Martinez, also encouraging people to read fiction written by women, that we can make these books or these stories more visible.
Okay, so now I would like to answer a question that you may ask yourselves. If I'm going to read Spanish science fiction, what am I going to find? What am I going to read? So in Spanish science fiction, or in Spanish speculative fiction, we find for all kinds of genres, like epic fantasy. For instance, you have works by Guillem López, or works by Arantzazu Serrano, or by León Arsenal, Pablo Bueno. We have hard science fiction by Sergio Mars, by Juan Miguel Aguilera. We have all the variety of topics in international science fiction. But when thinking about this question, I realized that there are two main topics that Spanish science fiction is specific about, or that are characteristic of Spanish science fiction, and that cover some or many of the most relevant and important works. One is when we look back into our history and consider alternative history. So there are many stories, many novels that consider what would have happened if, for instance, Franco wouldn't have won the Civil War. We have this anthology called precisely Franco, an Alternative History, which includes stories by many well-known authors. In particular, for instance, I'm very fond of this story by David Soriano, which takes place around a big match of football between Barcelona and Real Madrid. But the difference is that the capital is now Barcelona. The official language of Spain is Catalan. And the people from Castilla are the independentists, and they try to sabotage this match with a bomb. So it's like, whoa, something different, okay? We also have this story by Javier Negrete in this anthology, which is called The Red Angel. And in this story, Franco is a supervillain, and the Red Angel is a superhero who fights against this villain. So this is kind of a question that many Spanish science fiction authors have asked about. What would have happened if our recent history would have been different? For instance, The Stamp Collector, El Coleccionista de Sellos, by César Mallorquí, one of the best short story writers in Spain, also wrote this story, which is about an alternative history in which Franco dies just after the Civil War. Okay, so this is kind of a big topic. We also have the series of The Chronicles of Darkness by Eduardo Vaquerizo, in which the King Philip II dies, and then his half-brother Juan de Austria becomes the king. And that fact that happened many centuries ago has a big influence on how the story, the history develops from that point. So the Spanish Empire is still on in the 20th century. But this is something similar to Pavan by Keith Roberts. There is like not so many progress as we have today. So he has written 2 novels in this series. He has written some short stories. I will talk later about one of them because it's included in Castles in Spain. And he also has edited an anthology opening his universe to other writers. So other writers, for instance, Cristina Jurado, have written about what would have happened in this alternative history. We also have, for instance, Bulzazu by Ekaíz Ortega, which is nominated for this year's Ignotus Award, which is about an alternative end to the Second World War, in which Germany occupies Spain. So you see, this is something that we get once and again. For instance, Rila by Juan Miguel Aguilera, a very well-known novel, in which the Arabs are the ones that get to America before many centuries before Columbus, and many other different alternative histories that our authors have imagined. So this is like, we look back to our history and we imagine what could have happened. Another important topic in Spanish science fiction, well, of course, if we include steampunk also in this kind of alternative history, we also have many well-known stories and novels, okay? But if now we look to the future, a recent topic or a recent very important movement is the one that tries to warn us about what could happen in the future. So we have many dystopic futures, post-apocalyptic futures. For instance, this anthology which was published, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, Mañana Todavía, Still Tomorrow, edited by Ricard Ruiz Garzón, in which many classic authors of Spanish science fiction and new authors imagine dystopic and post-apocalyptic futures. For instance, one of the stories included in this anthology, Gracia by Susana Vallejo, has been recently translated into English. You can find it in the Strange Horizons special issue devoted to Spanish science fiction. But we also have, for instance, Cenital by Emilio Bueso, which is about what would happen if we ran out of oil. Okay, so this is also a very important topic. Green punk, Cli-Fi, Marian Womack is writing many stories about Cli-Fi. Diony Arroyo is writing also green punk. We also have, for instance, Nos Mienten, They Lied to Us by Eduardo Vaquerizo, which is kind of a cyberpunk meets dystopic future, very interesting, also nominated for this year's Ignotus Award. The Flock by César Mallorquí, one of the most beloved stories in Spanish science fiction, which is about what happens after the world ends. The Firewall by Luis Ángel Cofiño, which is set in a world like 200 years from now, in which the sea level has risen and many places, many cities in Europe have been flooded. So to keep everything under control, France is in charge of controlling Spain, Spain is in charge of controlling other country, and it has a very interesting structure because it's the same story told 4 times from different points of view, and at the end of each of these stories, you are surprised because you discover something new that adds to what you knew from the previous story. So there are many stories set in either post-apocalyptic or dystopic future nowadays in Spanish science fiction.
I would like to tackle now an issue that I think it's quite interesting phenomenon, which is the proliferation of short stories. Suddenly, editors start to publish or to select anthologies. Something there've always been anthologies of short stories in Spanish science fiction, but I think that right now we are witnessing a time where even main publishing companies are also betting on them. Not only small presses are interested, but big publishing companies. And this is, I think, has to do with the fact that for some time there were magazines dedicated to publish short stories and zines, but after a while, kind of they started to disappear, and there was a gap. There was a gap where authors were not able to really develop what I think, and it's not my words, is the words of Mariano Villarreal, one of our best editors, the seeds of what the genre is, which is short stories. Many authors can start bigger ideas by a small story, and that afterwards they develop. And it's very, very important to have a vehicle, a platform to be able to publish those stories, to get to be known by the public, to get feedback, and to maybe develop your work into some longer version or not, but at least to have the opportunity to be read. And I think anthologies recently have started to fill the gap that the absence of magazines had. And I can think of not only Terra Nova, which I would like Elías to help me with the authors there are in this anthology. I remember we had Memory by Teresa Pemira de Echevarría, which is an amazing Argentinian author. We have The Texture of Words, which is a novella, right? It's a novella. Yeah. By Felicidad Martínez, and the rest of the authors in Terra Nova in English are
Lola Robles with Deirdre, Eric J. Mota with Memories of a Zombie Country, Victor Conde with Light of a Solitary Candle, and Bodies by Juan Fran Jiménez.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a great opportunity to learn what's happening right now, what the ideas and the interests of authors right now. Other anthology that I wanted to talk about, I briefly spoke about, and Leti also spoke about it, is Spanish Women of Wonder, because I think it's it meant a shift in the attitude towards female authors in science fiction in Spain. It gave the opportunity to make visible women that were working, but they were not being published. So I wanted to mention all the female authors that were in this anthology, not only Teresa Pemira de Echevarría with Terpsichore, it's her short story, also Laura Ponce with The Storm, Felicidad Martínez with the short story
The Plague.
The Plague, exactly. I was thinking the translation in English. I can think of Red Houses by Nieves Delgado, who is somewhere in the audience. She was the winner of last year Ignotus Award for Best Short Story, and the second time in the history of the Ignotus Awards that this award was given to a woman. It's the third, but in short stories? In short stories. The previous year was Tamara Romero, and before
Elia Barceló.
Elia Barceló. I also want to mention another author was Yolanda Espiñeira with the She Will Method. We have Lola Robles, one of most best known authors that tackles issues about gender. Her short story is called Sea Changes. And I want to mention briefly that one of her novellas, El Informe Monteverde, which has been translated into English as the Diary of a Linguist, it's being published now in English. It's been recently released, which is, I think, is a very good, also a very good news. From Spanish Women of Wonder, also we have Carmen Torras. It's a Catalan science fiction writer. She normally writes in Catalan, but for Alucinadas, she wrote a fantastic story called The Team.
Memoria de equipo.
Memory of the Team, or
Team Memory.
Team Memory. And also we have Laila Martinez. She wrote it's a more cyberpunk with horror kind of story title Welcome to Croatoan. if I remember, I think that's the good title in English. We also have Sophia Rey, that wrote a story called Tech. And then we have, I think that's Mariam Womack. She wrote directly into English her story, which is, I can't think of the title in English. It's Cli-Fi, also very interesting. And I think that's all the stories. We have a bonus track, which is a short story written by Angelica Corodice, an Argentinian science fiction writer, who's been translated into English by Ursula Le Guin. Imagine. The title in English, I think it's Under the Electronic Moon. And the winner of the Spanish Woman of Wonder award, the one who won from all the stories who won the award by the publishing company was Terpsicore by Teresa Pemira Echevarria, which I describe as a quantum science fiction, but Elías doesn't think so.
No, it's quite correct.
It's quite interesting. It's very philosophical, mixed with technology. I wanted to mention that also Casa Rojas, Red Houses by Nieves, is also about the influence of technology in the future in our daily lives. It's something that I wanted to point out before I forgot. And not only this anthology is quite interesting, but we can think of the Visiones. Those are selected by the Spanish Association of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror. It's yearly. It's a yearly selection of
previously unpublished authors.
Exactly. And I think also Acronos is very interesting. It's been I think it's already they have three or four. Anthologies yearly or every 2 years of steampunk science fiction. This is by Fabricantes de Sueños, also is a publication of the Spanish Association of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror. And those are from already published.
Yeah, it's kind of the best of the previous year.
I forgot to mention, Anchronos is from Tyrannosaurus books. And I would like for Elías to talk a little bit about Castles in Spain and Mariposas del Oeste, because he was involved in those projects. And Castles in Spain was translated into English, and I think who's best to talk about it than he himself.
Well, in fact, this was an idea by, as almost always, Mariano Villarreal, who is a great promoter of Spanish science fiction. So when we knew that the Eurocon was going to be held here in Barcelona 2 years ago, we knew about this convention. He thought that it would be very nice to have an anthology to showcase not only the best, but the most representative works in Spanish short fiction. So he began thinking about what are the stories that better showcase what our best authors have produced. And we ran a crowdfunding campaign to get money for the translations, because usually the hard part is to be able to pay professional translations. And after a lot of work, I must say, we got enough money to translate the 10 stories that were our goal. And you can see the book at the dealer's room. It's a beautiful book, in my opinion. Of course, I cannot say any other thing, but I think if you see the cover with this Don Quixote and the dragon, I think you're going to fall in love with it. And the contents are even better, because you have, for instance, one of the stories I was talking about before, The Flock by César Mallorquí. We also have, for instance, My Daughter, My Wife by Domingo Santos. Domingo Santos is kind of the father of modern Spanish science fiction. He was devoted to editing the Nueva Dimensión, he was not in, in Nueva Dimensión and also in many other imprints, and he was a translator, he was a writer, he was an editor. And this is one of his most important stories. We also have stories by Elia Barceló, the first story to ever win the Ignotus Award, stories by Rodolfo Martinez, by León Arsenal, by Rafael Marín, by Félix J. Palma, who is quite well known in the English market because his trilogy, the Victorian trilogy, which starts with The Map of Time, has been translated into English. We also have works by Javier Negrete, Eduardo Vaquerizo. I really think that it's nowadays the best place to start reading Spanish science fiction if you read English and you don't read Spanish. Really, it has many, many very good stories. And what is more important, it has a lot of variety, many different stories from different authors, and you get an idea of what Spanish science fiction is.
And could you talk about Mariposas del Oeste briefly?
Mariposas del Oeste, it's quite different from Butterflies from the West.
From the West.
This is completely different to Castles in Spain. This is an anthology of unpublished stories by writers such as, where is Javier? Javier Castañeda, Sergio Mars, Ecaíz Ortega. I talked before about Bulzazu. This story is included in the anthology. The anthology itself is also nominated for this year's Ignotus Award. Some of the stories, one by Javier, the one by Sergio Mars, the one by Ecaíz, are also nominated. So this is kind of, as Cristina was mentioning before, a place for established and new authors who are writing interesting stories to get their work published. Because, well, with the exception of Supersonic, Delirio, and maybe a couple more magazines, there are not many places to publish this story. So the idea is to try to publish every year or every 2 years a new anthology which features new works.
What we're going to do now, it's each of us, we're going to talk about a few books that we recommend. There are science fiction books translated into English that we recommend people to read if they are interested in our science fiction. And I would like to start with Leti.
Well, I have chosen 2 different books. One is translated into English and the other one is translated into French. So all of you maybe can read. If you can read English, you can choose one, and if you can read French, you can read the other. The one translated into English has been mentioned by Elías. It's called the Victorian trilogy. The first one is the Map of Time, and there are two more: the Map of the Sky and the Map of Chaos. Pardon. Sorry. They are written by Félix J. Palma. It's a kind of I don't want to talk about the story in itself because I don't want to spoil the fun for you, but it is written in quite a wonderful prose, and it is really interesting, and it has surprises. And this is the one that is translated into English. In other languages also, but I don't know.
Polish, I guess, and maybe many different.
In Russian,
yeah, in
I
Russian.
think it is also translated into Russian. And the other book that I want to recommend, which is also a saga, it's a series, is La Espada de Fuego de Javier Negrete, which begins as a fantasy history and develops in something else. also, I don't want to spoil anything. There are 4 of these books. The first one is La Espada de Fuego. It is translated into French, which I'm not going to try to tell the title, because if my English is bad, you can imagine my French.
L'épée de feu.
Whoa.
Thank you. And these are the books that are translated into other languages. And we also want to talk about books that we suppose that can be will be interesting to be translated into other languages. For example, I think Cibercianos by Santiago García Albás, who are 4 novellas related to virtual reality and the perception of reality that can be different with the modern technology. It's a very interesting. There are very interesting readings, and I think they can be a good read if they are translated into other languages. I also want to recommend La mirada extraña de Felicidad Martínez, that it is a science fiction that can be described as pure science fiction. It's not an easy read, even in Spanish, so I don't know if it will be easy to translate it into English, but I think the effort is worth the time of the translation. And also Challenger by Guillem López.
Which is also nominated for
this
Notch
year in Notch Awards.
Elías, you want to go?
Yeah, so I've already talked about the 2 books I wanted to recommend that are translated into English. So Castles in Spain, Terra Nova. I only want to add that with those 2 books, you get an idea of the history, the recent history of Spanish science fiction with Castles in Spain, and what is being produced now with Terra Nova. So if you get the 2, you get the best of the history and what we are doing now. About books that I would like to be translated in other languages, well, into English mainly, A Casa Puspa, because it is already translated into French at least, by Juan Miguel Aguilera and Javier Redal, which are very well known in France at least. This is a wonderful, hard space opera. It's kind of mind-blowing. It's kind of one of the best space operas I've ever read, and I'm really into space opera, so I would love to see that translated into English, because I think it's really perfect for the English reader, okay? So this is my first advice for, sorry? Yeah, it's kind of similar to Larry Niven, but with, I think, more action and kind of Peter F. Hamilton meets Frank Herbert and Larry Niven, so really good stuff. And another book, well, among many others that I would love to see translated into English. Well, more than a book, is kind of 2 short stories, which are Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is also very big in Spain. You have the translation of La Sonrisa del Gato, Cat's World, by Rodolfo Martínez, which was the first Spanish cyberpunk novel. But I also like very much these works by José Antonio Cotrina, Salir de Fase and Mala Racha, like Out of Phase and Bad Streak. These are kind of, if you read John Barley's story of the 8 worlds, in that vein, really good stuff, and I think that would really be very interesting for people who read in English.
I'm going to go with 2 books that I already mentioned. A Spanish Woman of Wonder, for obvious reasons, I edited with Leti, and The Best of Spanish Steampunk by Nevsky, which is a collection of stories, of steampunk stories, very interested, and you can find them in English. But I also would like to briefly mention Supersonic because even though it's a Spanish magazine of science fiction, fantasy, horror, weird, speculative fiction, what is interesting is that a part of it is in English. You can find content in Spanish and some content in English. Why? Because we feel that there are authors, Spanish authors that are starting to write directly into English and they don't have an easy time to get to be known or to be published, so we wanted to address that. But also there are some authors, English authors living in Spain who are trying to, who would like to be also be known in Spain by his English writings, and I'm thinking Steve Redwood, we've also published Suburg, etc., etc. And the books I wanted to see translated are La polilla en la casa del humo, The Moth in the House of Smoke by Guillem López. Leti spoke about Challenger earlier, which is the novel that has been nominated for this year's Ignotus Awards. The one I'm talking about is the most recent novel that he has published a few months ago. I think it's very interesting. It's kind of like a subterranean, underground dystopia. Very interested. I also would like to talk about one collection of short story by the same author. It's called 18 Engranajes, 18 Wheels by Nieves Delgado. And it's basically short stories of science fiction, where technology influences our daily life in many ways. And last but not least, Retrofuturo. Retrofuturo is an anthology edited by Guillem López for Cazador de Ratas Publishing Company. And in that one we have an alternative view of the 70s in Spain, with short stories by Guillem López, Jesús Cañada, Sofía Rey, Mariam Womack, Alfredo Álamo, Juanma Santiago, Francisco J. Pérez, Colectivo Juan de Madre, myself. And I think it's a fantastic collection with a very powerful prose and very powerful topics about an alternative past. And also Nieves Delgado is in that one. I don't want to forget. And I think we only have time for a few questions. If any of you have questions, please feel free to ask.
You've several times mentioned a book, I'm sorry, I lost the exact title, something about female Spanish authors that I think you edited.
Yes.
Is that available in English?
Yes, Spanish Woman of Wonder. We did also a crowdfunding to get enough funding to get it translated into English by specialized translators. And you can find it in the bag that was given to all attendees when you get registered. There is an envelope with postcards, and you can see in the back of the postcard there's a link to the download. You can download it and enjoy it.
And is that available in Spanish? Because I would prefer to read it in Spanish.
No, yes, it is available in Spanish. You can also buy it in Lectu, the platform.
Probably from the same link of the English version that you get with the postcard, you can get to the Spanish edition. I guess.
Yes.
Yes, it is. Both in print and digital formats.
You didn't say many words about Elia Barcego. I'm a French translator. Mm-hmm. I translated a short novel, Peel, and a novella, and a short story. I think she deserves to be translated into English.
Yes, of course, but several of her works have been translated into English, if I'm not mistaken. At least Heart of Tango and El Secreto del Orfebre. I don't know what's the title in English, but at least two of her novels I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2, maybe 3 are already translated into English.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very, very great. I teach Spanish in the United States, and I teach science fiction, and a lot of times I really don't know what words to teach because we don't have everything that we have around, so I have to go and search and pick here and there. And I would like to know if you can tell me, if you mentioned a couple of anthologies which probably are going to be great, and I'm going to check them out afterwards. But my question is there like a selection that it's maybe it's been conceived as a specific topic? For example, I was interested in seeing what short stories of science fiction address issues of gender, for example. Do we have, can you comment on that? Could I be able to really find a way to kind of like catalog those short stories into either genres or topics, or are they just in a general way an anthology with various topics and approaches to science fiction?
I don't know if I understand your question. You mean anthologies that have been translated into English, or also in Spanish?
No, what I want is Spanish text. I don't want English, because what I want to use the original text in Spanish. But I want to see, for example, do we have short stories fiction, of science fiction that address issues of gender in science fiction?
Like thematic anthologies or something like that, you mean? I'm not sure that nowadays we have that kind of anthology. We have the steampunk ones, maybe the dystopic ones like Mañana Todavía. But I think the most part of anthologies are like more like general anthologies. There are stories that deal with topics like gender issues and that kind of thing. But it's not, I don't remember now of a specific anthology. Yeah, there is one, the Mechanical Abyss, which is about artificial intelligence. But maybe we can talk later, and we'll point you to some. Thank you for the question.
We don't have more time for questions. We wanted to thank you for coming at this time. We thought everybody will be eating, so thank you so much.
Thank you.